The rain came with the fury of a betrayed god, hammering the roof of the one-room schoolhouse until the very timbers seemed to groan in protest. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled a mournful, relentless sound that stripped the last of the October leaves from the cottonwoods and scoured the dusty streets of Cedar Falls clean. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool lamp oil and a silence more terrifying than the storm itself. Amelia Ward stood beside her simple pine desk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white peaks in a landscape of pale skin. The lantern light threw her shadow long and distorted against the blackboard where the day's lessons neatly chalked sums and the flowing script of a Longfellow poem were a ghost of a life that no longer existed. That life had ended the moment Judge Augustus Crane had kicked open her door. He stood by the cold potbelly stove, not even bothering to remove his oilskin duster, which dripped a dark puddle onto the floorboards. Water beaded on the brim of his hat, clinging to the silver threads in his immaculately trimmed beard. He was a man of precise, deliberate movements, and even now in the heart of this confrontation, he radiated an unnerving calm. Beside him stood two of his hired men, grizzled figures named Harker and Cole, their hands resting on the butts of their holstered pistols. They smelled of whiskey and rain, their eyes vacant and incurious. They were merely instruments. The judge was the hand that wielded them. Miss Ward Crane began his voice, a low-cultured baritone that carried effortlessly over the storm's cacophony. It was the same voice that delivered sentences from the bench, a voice of unimpeachable authority, in a town that had long ago learned not to question him. I am a patient man, but my patience, like this unfortunate storm, has a finite duration. You are sheltering a fugitive, a savage. Give the boy to me. Amelia's gaze flickered to the worn rag rug near the hearth. Beneath it, a loose floorboard concealed a small dark space, a makeshift sanctuary that now felt like a tomb. She could feel the faint tremor of the child hidden there, a boy no older than 10, his leg crudely bandaged where a rifle ball had torn through the flesh. His name was Kitchie. She had found him near the Blackwater River at dusk, collapsed and feverish, and had carried him here to the only place she considered safe. She had been a fool. He is a child judge, she said, her own voice steadier than she felt. She had been the town school teacher for 3 years, a quiet, respected figure known for her calm demeanor and her dedication to the children of this hard land. No one had ever seen this defiance in her. She hadn't known it was there herself. He is wounded and needs a doctor, not a cell. Crane offered a smile that did not touch his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and remote. He needs justice. His kind raided the Miller homestead last week, burned it to the ground. That boy is no different from the men who did it. The sickness is in the blood. He took a deliberate step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I will ask you one last time. Where is he? Amelia's resolve wavered. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She was alone. The townsfolk were huddled in their homes, shutters bolted, too afraid of the storm, too afraid of him to interfere. She was an educated woman from the East, a believer in law and reason. But here reason was whatever Judge Crane said it was. She could give the boy up. She could live. It would be simple. But then an image flashed in her mind, unbidden and sharp, with a grief she had kept buried for 15 years. It was the memory of the boy Kitchie, when she had first lifted him into the schoolhouse. Delirious with pain, he had been clutching a small object in his hand. As she'd cleaned his wound, his fingers had uncurled, revealing a piece of carved wood, worn smooth with handling. It was a hawk. Its wings were swept back, its head cocked in an expression of fierce, silent vigilance. The sight had stolen the breath from her lungs. On the mantelpiece of her small rented room behind the general store, in a box filled with her few keepsakes, sat its twin. A small wooden hawk carved from the same dark pine, with the same patient, loving detail. a gift from her father, carved the winter before the fire that had taken him from her. The fire she had been told was set during a Lakota raid. She had never seen another like it. Until now, that small piece of wood resting in a feverish child's palm had shattered the fragile peace she had built for herself. It wasn't a moral principle that now held her fast. It was a ghost. It was the sudden, shocking resurrection of a love so profound that its loss had nearly broken her. Seeing the hawk had not just made her protective of the boy. It had made his fate inseparable from her own buried past. To surrender him would be to betray her father's memory all over again. "I don't know what you're talking about." She lied, her voice a raw whisper. The judge's smile vanished. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the cold, hard granite beneath. "Very well." He gestured to his men with a flick of his wrist. "The floorboards, Harker. Start with the rug." Harker moved forward, a brutish grin spreading across his face. Amelia instinctively stepped in his path, placing herself between him and the rug. "No!" She said the word, a small, solid thing in the roaring chaos of the storm. Miss Ward Crane sighed a sound of theatrical disappointment. "Progress requires us to prune the weeds that choke a community. Surely you understand the necessity of a clean garden." Before she could answer, Cole's arm snaked around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. He was immensely strong, and her struggle was useless. She could only watch in horror as Harker kicked the rug aside and wedged a crowbar under the edge of the floorboard. The wood splintered and groaned. A faint cry came from below. "There," Crane said, his voice flat with satisfaction. Harker ripped the board free, revealing the small, terrified face of Kitchie, his dark eyes wide with pain and fear. In his hand, he still clutched the wooden hawk, holding it up as if it were a shield. Crane's gaze fell upon the carving. For a fleeting, imperceptible moment, his expression changed. The cold certainty faltered, replaced by a flicker of something else, a shadow of confusion or perhaps recognition. It was gone as quickly as it came. He looked back at Amelia, his eyes narrowing. "You will regret this, Miss Ward. You will come to understand that in this world there is the law and there is the wilderness. You have just chosen the wilderness." He nodded to his men. They dragged her toward the door, her heels scraping against the floor she had swept so carefully just that morning. The wind tore the door from Harker's grasp, slamming it against the outer wall. A maelstrom of rain and fury flooded the room, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into a world of roaring darkness and violent, grasping shadows. The last thing she saw was Crane reaching down not for the boy, but for the small wooden hawk that had fallen from Kitchie's grasp. Cedar Falls was a town built on fear. It clung to the banks of the Blackwater River, a small, desperate outpost of civilization in an endless expanse of ochre dust, where the wind whispered secrets through sun-bleached cattle skulls. Its lifeblood was not the river, but the absolute will of Judge Augustus Crane. He owned the land, held the mortgage on the general store, and paid the salary of the town's only lawman, a perpetually drunk sheriff who was little more than a placeholder. Crane had arrived a decade ago, a man of wealth and Eastern breeding, and had systematically wrapped the town in a web of debt and obligation until it was his personal fiefdom. The official story, the one repeated in the saloon and over the Cracker Barrel at the Mercantile, was that the judge was bringing progress. A railroad spur was coming through, and Crane was acquiring the necessary land, including the Lakota Treaty lands north of the river, to ensure Cedar Falls became a prosperous hub. The recent attacks, like the one on the Miller homestead, were cited as proof that the Lakota were an obstacle to that progress, a dangerous element that needed to be cleared away. Amelia Ward, in her quiet life, had never questioned it. She had arrived 3 years prior, a woman seeking refuge from her own past, and had found a sense of purpose in the faces of her students. She taught them reading, writing, and the quiet virtues of a world governed by order and civility. Her life was measured and contained a careful construct built to keep the ghosts at bay. The memory of her father, a gentle man who had believed in coexistence and had taught her to see the beauty in both the settlers' world and the Lakotas, was a pain she kept locked away. His death in a supposed raid had been a brutal lesson in the failure of such ideals, a lesson she had taken to heart. She lived by the rules kept to herself and never made trouble, until now. Far from the town, nestled in the rocky bluffs that overlooked the river valley, another man watched the storm. Sanka Wakan, a Lakota warrior whose name meant sacred horse, lay motionless beneath an overhang of weathered granite. Rain streamed from the rock face, forming a curtain that obscured the world, but his eyes, accustomed to seeing through nature's veils, remained fixed on the distant, flickering light of the schoolhouse. He was a man carved from the land itself, his features as stark and enduring as the rock that sheltered him. His face was a roadmap of loss of battles fought and family taken. He was a ghost in his own land, a remnant of a people being systematically squeezed into submission. He had been tracking the movements of Crane's men for weeks, watching their incursions into his people's territory, noting their provocations. He was a scout, a protector, his purpose singular and clear, to watch, to wait, and to strike only when necessary. He had seen the schoolteacher find the boy Kitchi, his own distant cousin. He had watched her carry him a small broken bundle into the schoolhouse, and a flicker of hope had ignited within him. Perhaps not all the settlers were like Crane. Perhaps the woman with the gentle face remembered the old ways of peace. But then he had seen Crane and his men arrive. He had seen the struggle, the door thrown open to the storm. He knew what Crane was. He was not a builder of towns, but a destroyer of worlds. His talk of railroads was a lie, a smokescreen for a deeper, more personal hatred that Sanka Wakan could feel like a change in the wind. He had seen it in the judge's eyes once during a parley that had ended in violence years ago. It was a cold, obsessive fire. He pushed himself to his feet, a silent, fluid movement. The wind tugged at his drenched buckskins, but he was indifferent to its chill. His duty was to the boy. His path was now intertwined with that of the woman. He moved from the shelter of the rock, melting into the storm-lashed landscape, his steps as silent as the falling rain. The schoolhouse light had been extinguished. The time for watching was over. The Blackwater River was a churning, muddy beast, swollen with the storm's runoff. It tore at its banks, pulling rocks and entire trees into its greedy current. The roar was deafening, a physical presence that vibrated through Amelia's bones. Cole and Harker dragged her to the edge of the collapsing bank, the mud sucking at their boots. Judge's orders teacher Harker grunted, his breath a foul cloud in her face. He was enjoying this. Said you chose the wilderness. Time to get acquainted. They had bound her hands in front of her with a rough hemp rope. The knots were brutally tight, the rope already chafing her wrists raw. Terror, stark and absolute, seized her. This was not justice. This was not law. This was a raw, primal cruelty she had only ever read about in books. Please, she gasped, the word whipped away by the wind. Don't. Cole offered a dispassionate shrug. Nothing personal. With a coordinated heave, they threw her into the river. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs in a silent scream. The current snatched her immediately, a powerful, indifferent force that tumbled her end over end in the black, silt-filled water. She fought against the panic, her mind screaming for her to breathe, to swim. But she was helpless. Her waterlogged wool skirt wrapped around her legs like a shroud, dragging her down. The weight of it, combined with the relentless pull of the current, was an anchor chaining her to the riverbed. She surfaced once, choking, sputtering, catching a terrifying glimpse of the roiling sky and the dark, receding shoreline. Then the river pulled her under again, deeper this time. The roar of the water filled her ears, her head, her soul. Her lungs burned. Pinpricks of light danced behind her eyes. This is it, she thought with a strange, distant calm. This is the end. She thought of her father, of the hawk he had carved, of the boy hidden beneath the floorboards. A profound sense of failure washed over her, colder and more final than the water itself. And then something seized the back of her dress. It was not the snag of a branch or the pull of an eddy. It was a hand, a strong, determined grip that arrested her descent. She was being pulled upward toward the churning surface, toward the air her body so desperately craved. She broke the surface with a ragged, desperate gasp, gulping in the rain-laced air. A powerful arm wrapped around her chest, keeping her head above the water. Through the storm-swept darkness, she saw a face. It was lean and angular, framed by long black hair plastered to his skin by the rain. His eyes were dark and intense, fixed on her with a fierce concentration. It was a face she had seen in her town from a distance, a face the children whispered about, the Lakota warrior who sometimes watched from the hills. Sankawakan. He said nothing. There were no words that could be heard over the river's fury. His actions spoke for him. With one arm holding her fast, he swam with powerful economic strokes, angling them away from the treacherous heart of the current and toward the relative calm of the far bank. He was impossibly strong, moving through the water with a familiarity that suggested it was as much his element as the land. The fight was brutal. The river did not want to let them go. Debris, a fence post, a dead animal surged past them in the darkness. Twice they were pulled under by the undertow, only for Sankawakan to fight his way back to the surface, his grip on her never faltering. Amelia, weak and disoriented, could do little more than cling to him, her bound hands a useless weight. She was a liability, and she knew it. But he did not abandon her. Finally, his feet found purchase in the thick, clinging mud of the opposite shore. He dragged her from the water's edge, pulling her past the line of skeletal willows and onto a patch of rain-soaked grass. He collapsed beside her, his chest heaving with the effort. For a long moment they lay there, two disparate souls united by a shared ordeal, the storm raging around them as their breath slowly returned to a ragged rhythm. Amelia pushed herself onto her elbows, shivering uncontrollably. Her dress was ruined, caked in mud and weighing her down. She was a fugitive, hunted. Her life in Cedar Falls, her school, her quiet existence, all of it had been washed away by the river. Her life was now irrevocably tied to this silent stranger who had just pulled her from a watery grave. Sankawakan rose to a crouch, his eyes scanning the opposite bank. The lights of Cedar Falls were a distant, hazy glow a world away. He turned back to her. In the dim, watery light, she saw the grim set of his jaw. He pulled a knife from a sheath on his belt and without a word sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The relief was so intense it was painful. She rubbed her raw, bleeding skin, her mind reeling. Why, she managed to ask, her voice hoarse. "Why did you help me?" He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see straight through her, to the fear and confusion that churned within. He pointed back across the river toward the unseen schoolhouse. "The boy," he said, his English simple accented. "Kitchi. He is my people." He then tapped his own chest. "You saved him. I save you." It was a simple equation. A life for a life. The law of the wilderness Judge Crane had spoken of. Amelia looked at her hands, then at the silent warrior before her. She was no longer just a school teacher. She was a player in a much older, more dangerous game, and she had no idea of the rules. The wilderness did not welcome them. It was a landscape of sharp edges and cold indifference. For 3 days, they moved north away from the river and into the broken, rocky hill country that formed the border of the Lakota lands. Sankawakan led them with an unerring sense of direction, while Amelia struggled to keep up. Her town shoes shredded her body, a tapestry of aches and bruises. They traveled with Kitchi, whom Sankawakan had retrieved from the schoolhouse under the cover of the storm's chaotic aftermath. The boy was weak, his fever a persistent fire, and he leaned heavily on Amelia, his small hand often finding hers. Their alliance was one of necessity forged in silence and communicated through gestures. Sanka Wakan was a man of profound stillness, his presence a stark contrast to the nervous energy that thrummed through Amelia. He taught her without words how to walk silently, how to read the signs of the land, how to find shelter in the lee of a rock outcropping. He would hunt returning with a rabbit or a grouse, which he would cook over a small smokeless fire, sharing the meager meal with a solemn grace. Amelia, in turn, tended to Kitchi. She used the knowledge gleaned from her father's old naturalist books to find yarrow to pack the boy's wound and willow bark to brew a bitter tea for his fever. A quiet understanding grew between them. Sanka Wakan would bring her the plants she pointed out, recognizing her expertise in a world he did not fully comprehend, just as she was learning to trust his mastery of his own. The first time they truly spoke was on the third night. Kitchi was finally sleeping peacefully, his fever having broken. They sat by the embers of their fire, hidden in a shallow cave, whose entrance was veiled by a thicket of juniper. The threat of Crane's posse was a constant, unspoken presence. They could be anywhere. "He will not stop," Sanka Wakan said, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the cave. "Crane, I know," Amelia whispered. "But I don't understand why. It's more than just the land for the railroad. It's personal. For him." Sanka Wakan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "He has a long memory. The hate in him is an old tree with deep roots." Amelia pulled her knees to her chest, trying to conserve warmth. "The hawk," she said, the question pushing its way out. "The one Kitchi was holding. My father carved one just like it. For me. Years ago." For the first time, a flicker of surprise showed in Sanka Wakan's eyes. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and drew something out. He held it in his palm, the firelight catching on the worn, dark wood. It was the hawk. "Crane must have dropped it in the schoolhouse. This carving," he said slowly. "It is a marker, a sign of the Hawk Society. Men who walked the path of peace. Men who believed your people and my people could share this land." He paused, his voice dropping. "There are not many left." Amelia stared at the small bird, her heart pounding. Her father. A man she remembered as a gentle farmer and amateur scholar, a man who traded with the Lakota and tried to learn their language. A man the settlers had called a dreamer and later a fool. He had been part of this society of peacemakers. "My father died in a raid," and she said the words tasting like ash. "The people in town, they always said his beliefs are what got him killed, that he was too trusting." Sanka Wakan was silent for a long time, turning the wooden hawk over in his fingers. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the story that is told is not the story that happened. Crane tells a story that serves him." They were interrupted by the distant sound of a shod horse stumbling on rock. Instantly, Sanka Wakan was on his feet, stamping out the embers with his moccasin. He pressed his finger to his lips, ushering Amelia and the now awake Kitchi deeper into the cave's shadows. He drew his knife, his body coiling with a lethal tension. The posse. They could hear the men's voices, now rough and angry, carried on the night air. They were close. Too close. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. She held Kitchi tight, her hand over his mouth, praying he wouldn't make a sound. They were trapped. This small cave, their only sanctuary, was about to become their tomb. The voices of the posse grew louder, a slurry of curses and frustrated shouts. Harker's gruff tones were unmistakable. "He's got to be around here somewhere. The judge wants that woman and the savage. And he wants him alive." Amelia pressed herself and Kitchi further into the narrow fissure at the back of the cave. The rock was cold and damp against her back. Sanka Wakan stood like a statue at the entrance, a silhouette against the faint starlight, his knife a sliver of darkness in his hand. He was one man against at least 3 or 4 a fight he could not win. Just as a horse nickered a few dozen yards away, a new sound split the night, the high, keening cry of a mountain lion. It was a chilling territorial scream that echoed off the canyon walls. It was answered by another cry, this one from a different direction, closer. The posse's voices changed, their bravado replaced by a nervous tension. "Cougars," one of them muttered. "Hate these damn hills at night." "Spread out," Harker commanded, his voice tight. "Check these caves. Cole, you take that one." A shadow detached itself from the group and started toward their hiding place. Amelia's breath hitched. Sanka Wakan braced himself, preparing to sell his life dearly. Suddenly, from the darkness just beyond the cave, a rock clattered down a steep embankment. It was a small sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. What was that? Cole hissed, freezing in his tracks. Another rock followed, then a shower of pebbles, as if a large animal was moving carelessly along the ridge above them. The mountain lion screamed again, this time seemingly right on top of them. "Forget it," Harker snapped. "It's just cats and loose rock. We'll come back with dogs at dawn. Let's get back to the horses." The men grumbled their agreement, their fear of the unseen predators outweighing their fear of the judge. Amelia listened as the sound of their horses faded into the distance, her body trembling with a relief so profound it left her weak. Sanka Wakan remained motionless for a long time before finally relaxing his stance. He turned back to her, and in the faint light, she saw a ghost of a smile touch his lips. He pointed a finger at his own chest, then puckered his lips and perfectly mimicked the cougar's cry. He then flicked his wrist, a gesture indicating a thrown stone. He had created the diversion himself. He had used his knowledge of the land and its creatures to trick the posse, turning the wilderness they feared into his greatest ally. Amelia stared at him, a newfound respect dawning in her eyes. He was more than a warrior. He was a tactician, a survivor. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice low. "They will return. We go back." "Back," Amelia whispered, horrified. "Back to Cedar Falls. They'll be looking for us everywhere." "They will look for us here," he countered, gesturing to the wild hills around them. "In the wilderness. They will not look for us in the heart of the snake's nest. There is a man there, a healer, Dr. Vance. He is not Crane's man." Amelia thought of the town doctor, Elias Vance, a quiet, bookish man who seemed as out of place in Cedar Falls as she was. He had always been kind, with a sadness in his eyes that she recognized. She had seen him in quiet opposition to Crane at town meetings, never speaking out directly, but always voting no with a quiet, stubborn firmness. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. Returning to town was a desperate gamble. But it was there, in the heart of her enemy's territory, that Amelia's role began to shift. Hidden in the dusty attic of Dr. Vance's infirmary, listening to the sounds of the town she once called home, she transformed from a fugitive into an investigator. Dr. Vance, a man whose quiet demeanor concealed a core of steely integrity, confirmed their suspicions. "Crane's obsession with this land makes no sense," he said one evening, his face etched with worry in the lamplight, as he changed the dressing on Kitchy's now healing leg. "The railroad surveyors were here last spring. They told me themselves the spur line was planned to follow the southern ridge. It comes nowhere near the Lakota treaty lands or your family's old homestead, Amelia." A cold dread settled in Amelia's stomach. "My homestead. But that burned down 15 years ago. There's nothing there but ashes and memories." "Precisely," the doctor said, his eyes meeting hers. "And yet 2 weeks ago, I saw Crane out there himself, walking the land, with old survey maps from the county seat." "He's not after land, Amelia. He's looking for something on the land." While Sanka Wakan slipped out at night, a phantom gathering information from the shadows, Amelia, with Dr. Vance's help, began a different kind of hunt. They pored over the town's archives, stored in dusty crates in the doctor's cellar. They pieced together old land deeds, property transfer records, and the faded minutes of town council meetings from over a decade ago. A pattern began to emerge. Crane's acquisitions of land, which had seemed random and profit-driven, all circled one central point in the 30 acres of scorched earth where the Ward family home had once stood. He had bought up the surrounding parcels, methodically isolating the one piece of land that held the key to his obsession. The final piece of the puzzle came from Amelia's own fractured memory. Prodded by the doctor's gentle questions, she began to remember the night of the fire, not as the terrifying, chaotic event she had suppressed, but in sharp, sensory details. The smell of smoke, her father shouting her name, the heat on her skin, and one other thing, a memory so deeply buried she hadn't realized it was there. Her father, just before leading her out of the burning house, had been in his study. He wasn't gathering valuables or keepsakes. He was frantically trying to pry a loose stone from the base of the fireplace. Behind it was a small iron strongbox. He hadn't been able to get it out in time. He had pushed her toward the window, telling her to run and not look back. It was the last time she had seen him alive. A strongbox, she breathed the realization, hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He was looking for a strongbox hidden in the fireplace. The story had shifted. This was no longer about a railroad or land dispute. Judge Crane, the most powerful man in their world, was engaged in a desperate 15-year-long treasure hunt. And the treasure was buried in the ashes of Amelia's past. The fight for survival had become a race to uncover a secret powerful enough to drive a man like Crane to murder corruption and the brink of war. Their sanctuary was shattered by the heavy thud of a boot kicking in the infirmary's back door. Dr. Vance, who had been preparing a poultice, looked up with a weary resignation. Amelia, upstairs with Kitchy, froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Judge Crane stepped into the room flanked by Harker and Cole. He wasn't armed, but he didn't need to be. His power was an aura that preceded him. He surveyed the room with a look of detached disappointment, his gaze lingering on the extra bedroll in the corner. Elias Crane said, his voice deceptively gentle, "I am so very disappointed. I thought you at least were a man of science and reason, not a harbinger of sentiment." "They needed my help, Augustus," the doctor replied, his hands stained with herbs. "It's what I do." "Indeed." Crane's eyes drifted upward toward the ceiling. "And I wonder, does your professional duty extend to the attic?" There was no escape. They were caught. Sanka Wakan was out on a scouting mission, not due back until dawn. Amelia's mind raced, searching for an exit, an option, but found none. "Bring them down," Crane ordered. Harker's heavy footsteps on the attic stairs were like the drumbeat of a death sentence. He emerged moments later, shoving Amelia ahead of him. She held Kitchy's hand tightly, her body a shield in front of the boys. She met Crane's cold gaze with as much defiance as she could muster. An interesting reunion, Crane mused, circling them like a wolf. The teacher, the savage, and the good doctor. A veritable society of fools. He stopped in front of Amelia. "You've been busy? I imagine you believe you've uncovered some grand conspiracy." "We know you're not after land for a railroad," he said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're after something on my family's property. Something in the old fireplace." Crane actually laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "Clever. I underestimated you, Miss Ward. But you have the what and not the why. And the why is everything." He turned his attention to the doctor. "You, Elias, will serve as my invitation. Miss Ward and her protector are proving difficult to flush out. You will be the bait." He nodded to Cole. "Take him to the courthouse. Lock him in my office." Dr. Vance offered no resistance as Cole grabbed his arm. He simply looked at Amelia, his eyes filled with a silent, profound apology. As they dragged him away, Crane faced Amelia again, his expression hardening into something cruel and predatory. "You want to know why?" he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I will tell you, because you need to understand the righteousness of my cause. 15 years ago, on the night your father died, my family died too. Amelia stared at him, stunned into silence. My wife Eleanor and my daughter Clara Crane continued the names, spoken with a chilling lack of emotion. They were visiting the settlement. They died in the same raid that killed your father. But your father, he was not a victim. He was the cause. That's not true, Amelia choked out. He was a good man. He believed in peace. His belief in peace was a weakness that invited the wolves to our door. Crane's voice, for the first time, rose with a venomous passion, his composure cracking to reveal the raw wound beneath. He argued against fortifications. He preached coexistence. His pacifism left the entire settlement vulnerable. While my wife and child were being slaughtered, your father was hiding, trying to save his precious box of letters. He took a step closer, his face inches from hers. That strongbox contains his correspondence. Letters that will prove to the world what I have always known, that Thomas Ward was a traitor. A man who conspired with the savages, whose cowardice led to the deaths of a dozen innocent people, including my family. I have spent 15 years seeking the proof needed to destroy his name, to justify the war I will bring to these people, and to finally give my family the justice they were denied. The world tilted on its axis. He was twisting her memory, desecrating the image of the father she loved, turning him from a martyr into a villain. It was a monstrous, self-serving lie designed to fuel his own bottomless reservoir of hate. But the conviction in his eyes was terrifyingly real. He believed it. Every word. You have until dawn, Crane finished, his voice returning to its icy calm. Bring me the strongbox. I will trade you the doctor's life for it. If you are not at the courthouse by sunup, I will hang him from the rafters myself. And then my men and I will burn this town to the ground, looking for you. He turned and walked out, leaving Amelia in the ruins of her world, a terrible choice laid at her feet. She could save her friend by surrendering the very thing that might exonerate her father. Or she could fight and risk losing everything and everyone she had left. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mass of gray and purple, as the dust storm rolled in from the plains. It was an omen. The wind rose, carrying with it the grit and scent of the dry earth, howling through the deserted streets of Cedar Falls like a legion of ghosts. Shutters banged against walls. The town's tinny church bell tolled a frantic, irregular rhythm, struck by a loose rope in the gale. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a squat, imposing structure of stone and timber. It was Judge Crane's fortress, and inside, Dr. Vance was a prisoner. Sanka Wakan had returned just after Crane had left, his face grim, as Amelia relayed the ultimatum. There was no debate, no discussion of alternatives. Their path was set. He has the healer, Sanka Wakan had said the simple statement, carrying the weight of an unbreakable oath. We get him back. Their plan was desperate, born of necessity. Sanka Wakan would create a diversion, drawing the bulk of Crane's men away from the courthouse. In the ensuing chaos, Amelia, under the cover of the raging storm, would slip inside and find the evidence she needed to destroy Crane. The strongbox was no longer the goal. The truth was, he gave her his knife. For the healer's ropes, he set his hand lingering on hers for a moment. It was a gesture of profound trust. He was giving her his only weapon, his very survival, and placing it in her hands. Now, crouching behind a water trough across the street, the wind tearing at her hair and filling her mouth with dust, Amelia watched him work. He moved through the storm like a wraith. A fire suddenly erupted at the livery stable at the far end of town, a flaming arrow into a pile of dry hay. Shouts of alarm cut through the wind's howl. Harker, Cole, and 4 other men burst from the courthouse, their attention drawn to the blaze that was now greedily consuming the wooden structure. It was her chance. She ran head down across the open street. The dust was so thick it was like moving through a physical curtain. It stung her eyes, clogged her throat. She reached the side of the courthouse, finding the window to Crane's office. It was dark. Using the butt of the knife, she shattered a pane of glass, the sound swallowed by the storm. She cleared the jagged shards, hoisted herself up, and tumbled into the room. The office was a shrine to Crane's ego. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, the desk was a massive piece of mahogany, and a grandfather clock ticked with somber, inexorable authority in the corner. Dr. Vance was tied to a chair near the fireplace, a gag in his mouth. His eyes widened in alarm and relief as she rushed to his side, sawing at his bonds with Sanka Wakan's knife. "He's in the main courtroom," Vance whispered as soon as the gag was off. "Waiting for you." "Amelia, it's a trap." "I know," she said, helping him to his feet. "But the proof I need, it has to be here. His letters. My father's letters." As Vance massaged his wrists, Amelia's eyes scanned the room. The fireplace. The memory of her father, desperately clawing at the stone. She ran to it, her hands searching the rough-hewn rock of the foundation. Her fingers found it a single stone slightly looser than the others. Using the knife as a lever, she pried it free. Behind it was a dark cavity, and nestled inside was a small iron strongbox, rusted with age and damp. It was real. At that moment, the door to the office burst open. Judge Crane stood there, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. A grimly satisfied smile touched his lips. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist," he said, his voice calm despite the roaring wind outside that rattled the very windows in their frames. A daughter's sentiment. So predictable. He stepped into the room, kicking the doors shut behind him. The air grew thick, claustrophobic. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder each second, a hammer blow counting down their final moments. "Give it to me, Miss Ward," he commanded. Amelia clutched the heavy box to her chest. This was it. The culmination of a 15-year vendetta. Suddenly, a section of the bookshelf behind Crane swung inward, revealing a dark, hidden passageway. Sanka Wakan emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury. He had never gone to the livery. The fire was a diversion for the others, but his true target had always been Crane. Crane spun around, shock registering on his face for the first time. He was fast bringing the shotgun to bear, but Sanka Wakan was faster. He launched himself across the room, a silent, deadly projectile. He didn't try to disarm Crane. He slammed into him, driving him backward. The shotgun discharged its blast, deafening in the confined space, tearing a chunk of plaster from the ceiling. The two men crashed against the far wall, a whirlwind of desperate, violent motion. Crane was larger, but Sanka Wakan was fueled by a lifetime of grief and rage. While they struggled, another figure appeared in the doorway from the main courtroom. It was Kitchi. He had followed her, unwilling to be left behind. His eyes were wide with terror. Amelia, her heart pounding, fumbled with the rusted latch on the strongbox. It sprang open. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. But underneath them was something else. A leather-bound journal. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It was Judge Crane's. As the men fought their grunts and the crash of overturning furniture, a brutal counterpoint to the storm, Amelia read. And the full, monstrous truth was finally revealed. The journal was a confession, a litany of hate. Crane's wife and daughter hadn't been killed in a Lakota raid. They had died of cholera a year before the settlement fire. The raid itself, the one that had killed her father, had been a fiction, a lie. Crane had orchestrated the entire event. He had hired mercenaries, men disguised as Lakota warriors, to attack the settlement. His goal was to murder one man, Thomas Ward, the peacemaker, the one man who stood in the way of Crane's plan to seize the land for himself. But the fire had spread out of control, killing others. The letters from her father were not proof of his treason, but of his innocence. They were letters to territorial senators pleading for them to honor the Lakota treaties to protect the peace. The wooden hawk was the symbol of the society he had formed with Lakota elders, a secret council for peace. And then, the final soul-crushing revelation. In a journal entry dated 2 days after the fire, Crane wrote of a loose end. A Lakota family, a man and his wife, camped too close to the settlement, had witnessed the mercenaries. Crane had hunted them down and killed them himself to ensure their silence. Their young son, hidden in the woods, had escaped. A boy named Sankawakan. The three of them, Amelia Crane, Sankawakan, were not just adversaries. They were survivors of the same man-made tragedy. A triangle of pain bound together by a single night of fire and lies. Amelia represented justice. Crane, a twisted, vengeful grief. And Sankawakan, a righteous quest for retribution. Sankawakan finally gained the upper hand. He wrenched the shotgun from Crane's grasp and threw it aside. He drew his knife, a second one smaller that had been concealed in his boot. He backed Crane against the wall, the blade at his throat. Their eyes locked, a circuit of shared history and absolute hatred. This was the moment Sankawakan had lived for. The moment of revenge. Amelia looked from the journal to the two men. Her mind screamed for her to let it happen. Let Sankawakan have his vengeance. Crane was a monster who deserved to die. It would be justice. But her father's face swam in her memory. A man of peace. A man who believed the law, true law, was the only thing that separated men from savages. To stand by and watch a killing, even this killing, would be to betray everything he had lived and died for. It would make her no better than Crane. No, she cried out, her voice cutting through the din. Sankawakan, don't become him. Sankawakan's arm tensed the blade, pressing against Crane's skin, drawing a thin line of blood. His eyes, filled with a lifetime of pain, never left Crane's. He killed my family. He snarled the words torn from his soul. He killed your father. I know, Amelia said, stepping forward, holding out the journal, and we will make him pay. But we will do it with this. With the truth. We will not do it with this. She pointed to the knife. Her choice hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The choice between the cold, satisfying release of revenge and the difficult, uncertain path of justice. The grandfather clock ticked, the wind howled, and 3 lives broken by the same tragedy waited for a verdict. The dust began to settle both outside and in. The fury of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. In the dim light filtering through the dust-caked windows of the courthouse office, Sankawakan held his position, the knife still at Crane's throat. The battle was no longer physical. It was a war being waged in the warrior's soul. He looked from Crane's terrified, hate-filled eyes to Amelia's, which were pleading, filled not with judgment, but with a profound, shared understanding of their pain. He saw Kitchi standing in the doorway, a child who had already seen too much death. And in that moment, Sankawakan's choice was made. He was a protector, not a murderer. His future was with the boy, not in the bloody past. With a final guttural cry of anguish and release, he pulled the knife away and shoved Crane so hard that the judge crumpled to the floor, a broken, defeated man. The reign of Augustus Crane was overended, not by a bullet or a blade, but by the weight of his own monstrous truth. Just then the courthouse doors banged open. A group of hard-faced men in dusty coats strode in, rifles at the ready. They weren't Crane's posse. These were federal marshals. The lead marshal, a man with a graying mustache and weary eyes, took in the scene: the disheveled doctor, the armed Lakota warrior, the terrified boy, the woman clutching a journal, and the powerful town judge collapsed on the floor. We received a message from a Dr. Elias Vance. The marshal said, his voice a low rumble. Something about a murderer running this town. Amelia, with a foresight born of desperation, had entrusted a copy of the most damning pages of Crane's journal to a friendly stagecoach driver hours earlier, along with a desperate plea for help addressed to the territorial capital. Her gamble had paid off. The transfer of power was swift and absolute. Crane was taken into custody, his face a mask of disbelief. He was no longer a judge, just a common criminal, his web of lies unraveled for all to see. Harker and Cole were rounded up later, found drinking in the saloon, their authority having vanished with their employers. In the quiet aftermath, Amelia and Sanka Wakan stood outside the courthouse as the marshals restored order to a town waking from a long nightmare. They shared a moment not of triumph, but of quiet, somber understanding. Kichi Sanka Wakan said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "I will take him to our people's winter camp in the Wind River Valley. He will be safe there." Amelia nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Will you come back?" Sanka Wakan looked out at the distant mountains, their peaks painted purple by the rising sun. "My path is to watch over the boy now, to teach him the ways of our people. Not the path of vengeance, but the path of survival, of life." He met her eyes. "You have taught me there is another way, a harder way." He turned to leave, then paused, reaching into his pouch. He pressed the small wooden hawk into her hand. "Your father was a great man. Do not forget him." And with that, he and Kichi walked away, two figures disappearing into the vast, open country, leaving Amelia alone with the truth, the silence, and the promise of a new dawn for Cedar Falls. Months later, spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory. Not with a gentle whisper, but with a fierce, determined rush of life. The Blackwater River, once an instrument of death, now ran clear and gentle, its banks lined with the bright green of new cottonwood leaves. Cedar Falls was healing. Under the guidance of an interim council led by a surprisingly capable Dr. Vance, the town was slowly extricating itself from the tendrils of Crane's corruption. The fear that had suffocated its people for so long was gone, replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. Amelia Ward reopened her schoolhouse. The floorboards were scrubbed, the windows polished, and the blackboard wiped clean, ready for a new chapter. On the first day, the children of the town filed in, their faces bright with curiosity. But they were not the only students. A short while later, Sanka Wakan appeared at the door, and with him were Kichi and 3 other Lakota children, their expressions a mixture of shyness and defiance. He had kept his promise. He had ensured Kichi's safety, and now he had returned not as a warrior, but as an emissary of peace, bridging the divide that Crane had worked so hard to create. The schoolhouse became a new kind of frontier. It was a place where 2 cultures met, not with suspicion, but with the shared simple language of childhood. There were difficult days, moments of misunderstanding and fear, but Amelia guided them with a patient, unyielding grace, her belief in her father's vision now the bedrock of her life. One afternoon, as a warm breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of sagebrush, the mail rider delivered a letter bearing an official seal from the territorial capital in Cheyenne. Amelia opened it with trembling hands. It was a formal declaration based on the evidence of Crane's journal and her father's letters posthumously exonerating Thomas Ward of all suspicion. His name was cleared. His legacy, once buried under 15 years of lies, was restored. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she read the words. It was not a victory, but a quiet, profound peace. That evening, after the last of her students had gone home, she sat alone at her desk in the golden light of the setting sun. She took the small wooden hawk Kichi had given her, the one carved by a Lakota peacemaker, and placed it on the corner of her desk. Then from the small keepsake box she kept in her drawer, she took out its twin, the hawk her father had carved for her so long ago. She set them side by side. 2 hawks born of the same wood, the same hope, from 2 different hands, 2 different worlds. They stood together, their wings swept back, their gazes fixed on a shared horizon. They were a quiet testament to a healed past, and a symbol of a future yet to be written, one of forgiveness, community, and redemption.